welcome to Reformed thinking. So imagine you were holding this really old historical letter in your hands.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Right. And this is a letter that has shaped
Hmm.
the ethics and daily lives of, literally billions of people across millennia.
Yeah, a truly massive cultural and spiritual footprint.
So you look at the opening line,
Mhm.
and you're expecting the usual ancient formula, telling you who wrote it and who was supposed to receive it.
Which seems pretty binary.
Yeah, it should be. The address is either there on the parchment or it isn't. But then you realize the specific destination on the envelope, the actual city name, might be completely missing.
Which is a huge historical problem.
It really is. And that is what we're looking at today in this new deep dive. We are investigating a massive textual puzzle from the first century.
And we are pulling from some very thorough research for this.
Yes, specifically the extensive research and commentary notes of Clinton E. Arnold. We are taking this stack of academic sources and extracting the absolute most crucial nuggets of knowledge.
Custom tailored for you, the listener.
So you can be well informed without, drowning in all the raw data. Because the story here is wild. For nearly 1,800 years, the global church assumed the Apostle Paul wrote this specific letter directly to the church in Ephesus.
It was undisputed fact. Everyone agreed.
But then, in the 1800s, this massive academic shift happened. A few pieces of old parchment emerged from the dust, and they managed to overturn centuries of unanimous agreement.
Which sounds impossible, but it happened.
So how does a handful of ancient pages rewrite something considered settled history? Let's figure out what went down in those archives.
To really grasp the sheer scale of the shockwave this caused, we first have to understand the baseline. What the church universally held for those first 18 centuries.
The consensus was basically absolute, right?
Oh, totally unquestioned. Scholars, the monks copying texts in monasteries, and everyday people, they possessed a massive historical record.
How massive are we talking?
We are talking about over 5,000 distinct Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And in addition to the Greek text, we had every single ancient foreign language translation.
Like translations made early on for other regions.
Yeah, that includes the old Latin versions, the Coptic texts from Egypt, the Syriac, the Ethiopic, the Georgian, and the Slavonic.
Wow, that is a huge geographic spread.
It is. And every single one of them included the specific Greek words en Epheso, meaning in Ephesus, right there in verse 1.
So the opening literally read, "To the saints who are in Ephesus."
Yes. It was viewed as completely self-evident.
Okay, so 5,000 witnesses, all pointing in the identical direction, is a mountain of evidence. If 5,000 people tell me a car was blue, I am going to believe the car was blue.
That is a very logical conclusion.
But then the mid-1800s arrive. The Victorian era is in full swing, and there's this huge push to categorize and scientifically analyze everything.
And the academic world gets turned upside down.
Because 5 specific Greek manuscripts come to light, and in verse 1 of Ephesians, they are missing that place name. The words in Ephesus are just gone.
That mid-19th century context is crucial here. Scholars were scouring the globe, digging through old monastery libraries, looking for the oldest possible copies of the New Testament.
Right, trying to get closer to the source.
Yes. And while 5 manuscripts might seem like an insignificant drop in the bucket compared to 5,000, these were not ordinary manuscripts.
They had some serious weight to them.
Definitely. 3 of these 5 are considered by many text critics to be the big 3. They are regarded as some of the earliest and most reliable physical witnesses to the Greek New Testament that we possess.
Let's name them for the listeners so we know who the suspects are.
Sure. We have the 4th century Codex Vaticanus, which scholars designate with the letter B. Then we have the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, designated by the Hebrew letter Aleph.
And there's a papyrus one too, right?
Yes, a 3rd century papyrus codex from the Chester Beatty collection. It's known to the academic world as P46.
Okay, wait, time out. Before we go further into the academic earthquake, I think we need to clarify some of this terminology.
Sure. Good idea.
For those of us not digging around in ancient archives or reading Greek, what do these words actually mean? What is the physical difference between a papyrus codex and, say, those other manuscripts?
That is a very helpful clarification. In the ancient world, before the invention of the printing press or standard paper, people wrote on different materials.
Papyrus being one of the main ones.
Right. Papyrus is essentially ancient paper made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grows abundantly in Egypt. It is fragile and degrades easily.
And P46 is made of this plant material.
It is, and the term codex just means a book with bound pages, as opposed to a long scroll that you have to unroll.
Got it. So a papyrus codex is just an ancient book made of plant material.
Precisely. As time went on, the church started using parchment or vellum, which is treated animal skin.
Which is way more durable, I imagine.
Much more durable. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus are massive, beautiful Bibles written on this animal skin.
And the writing style changed over time too, right? Because you mentioned minuscule manuscripts earlier when talking about the two later ones that omitted the name.
Yes. The early manuscripts like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were written in what we call uncial script.
What does that look like?
It is basically all capital letters with no spaces between the words. It is very hard to read if you are not trained.
Oh, wow. Just a block of solid letters.
Yeah. Later on, around the 9th century, scribes developed a minuscule script which used smaller cursive letters. It was faster to write and took up less space on the expensive parchment.
Okay, so when we say we have a 3rd century papyrus codex and a 4th century uncial, we are talking about the absolute oldest physical formats of the New Testament surviving today.
Yes, the earliest tangible copies, and we often call them Alexandrian texts.
By Alexandrian.
Because this specific family of texts seems to trace its lineage back to the copying traditions in and around Alexandria, Egypt.
Which was a massive intellectual hub in the ancient world.
It really was a huge center for scholarship.
Okay, that paints a much clearer picture. We are dealing with extremely old, highly prized physical books from Egypt, and they are missing the words in Ephesus.
And this academic debate did not just stay locked away in a university library.
No, it trickled all the way down to the Bibles people read in their homes.
It did. In 1881, two illustrious British scholars named B.F. Westcott and F.J.A. Hort published a highly influential critical edition of the Greek New Testament.
And they leaned heavily on those Egyptian manuscripts.
They gave so much weight to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus that they printed the words in Ephesus in bold type and enclosed them in brackets.
Just to signal their doubt.
Yes. That was their way of signaling extreme skepticism about whether those words belonged in the text at all.
And the ripple effect of Westcott and Hort's decision was massive.
Yeah.
Their Greek text became the working basis for the English Revised Version in 1881.
Which started a chain reaction.
It did. That version then acted as the blueprint for the American Standard Version in 1901. And by the time the translation committees reached the Revised Standard Version in 1952, they went the furthest.
They actually eliminated the words in Ephesus entirely from the main text of the letter.
They relegated the location to a tiny footnote at the bottom of the page, just telling the reader that other ancient authorities included the phrase.
Which is a huge shift from 1,800 years of history.
And we still see the echoes of that 1952 decision today. If you open a modern translation, like the New Living Translation, the text will include in Ephesus, but you will see a footnote stating that the most ancient manuscripts do not include those words.
It is a debate that is still printed right there on the page.
But I have to push back on this entire methodology for a second.
Yeah.
I am trying to wrap my head around the logic here.
Okay, lay it out.
Let's use an analogy. It is like the game of telephone. If you want to know what the original whispered word was, do you trust the three people sitting closest to the start of the circle who might have misheard it? Or the 5,000 people at the end of the circle who all agree on what they heard?
That is a really great way to picture it.
Why do scholars immediately side with the three? Is older always automatically better?
The telephone analogy is brilliant for illustrating the problem text critics face. Scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries developed a very strong preference for the Alexandrian text type because of its age.
Because they are the people sitting closest to the original whisper.
Right. The logic was that because these manuscripts were physically older, they sat closer to the start of the circle, near the original autographs penned by the apostles.
But what about the fact that they are so outnumbered?
Well, the working assumption was that over centuries of copying, scribes tend to add things to clarify the text rather than delete things.
Ah, I see. They try to smooth it out.
Exactly. They smooth out rough grammar or they add a geographical note to make things clear. So Westcott and Hort leaned heavily on the principle that the shorter reading and the older reading is usually the most authentic one.
But there's a glaring flaw in assuming those specific Alexandrian texts are completely infallible.
What do you mean?
Just because a document is old does not mean the person copying it was having a good day or that they didn't have their own theological or practical reasons for changing something.
That observation is spot on. Relying almost exclusively on 3 manuscripts from one specific region creates a massive blind spot.
It's putting all your historical eggs in one Egyptian basket.
Yes. The discovery of P46 in the 1930s, which also omitted the name, seemed to vindicate Westcott and Hort to many in the academic world. But it also created a massive interpretive headache.
Because if Paul did not write in Ephesus, what did he write?
Yeah.
And why did he write it that way?
Right. If you take the name out, it is not just a missing fact, it breaks the sentence.
So scholars had to figure out what was happening in that opening sentence. Westcott and Hort looked at the evidence and proposed a solution called the blank space theory.
They hypothesized that Ephesians was never a letter to a single city. They argued it was actually a circular letter.
How would that work practically?
Under this theory, Paul wrote a general theological treatise intended for multiple churches scattered throughout the province of Asia Minor. He had multiple copies made, and he intentionally left a blank space in the opening greeting.
So he just left a physical gap on the animal skin?
That was the idea. His letter carrier, a man named Tychicus, was then supposed to verbally fill in the name of the specific church as he arrived at each destination, or perhaps write it into the blank space on the parchment before handing it over.
So we are essentially talking about a first-century mail merge.
A mail merge.
Yeah, it is like when you get a mass email today that says, "Dear bracket, insert name here, bracket," and the sender relies on the software to plug in "Dear John" or "Dear Sarah."
Oh, I see. Yes, that is a great comparison.
Westcott and Hort were suggesting Paul did an analog version of that. He wrote, "To the saints who are in blank."
To a modern mind accustomed to mass communication and efficient office administration, the mail merge idea sounds highly plausible.
It feels very efficient.
It does. But when we evaluate this theory against the actual historical record of the Greco-Roman world, the whole thing falls apart.
Really. There is no historical precedent for this.
There is zero parallel for this practice in the entire history of ancient letter writing. We have thousands of surviving letters from antiquity, business letters, personal correspondence, imperial decrees, and we simply do not find people leaving blank spaces for couriers to fill in geographical locations upon delivery.
Wow. It was just not a convention of ancient communication at all.
Not at all.
That is a massive red flag. If it was a standard practice for circular letters, we would see it elsewhere.
And the historical dismantling of this theory gets even worse.
Let me guess. It has to do with the physical copies.
Yes. If Tychicus was carrying around multiple copies and filling in different names as he traveled the Roman roads, we should find at least some surviving manuscripts with those other city names inserted.
Right. We should find an ancient papyrus that says, "To the saints who are in Smyrna," or in Pergamum, or in Sardis.
But we possess nothing of the sort. Every single manuscript that includes a place name, without exception, says Ephesus.
The complete absence of any alternative place names in the manuscript tradition makes the blank space theory highly improbable. You would expect at least one copyist from Colossae or Laodicea to preserve their own city's name if they received a customized version of the letter.
You absolutely would. But the problem is not just historical. The theory completely fractures when we look at the mechanics of the Greek language used in verse 1.
Right, let's make this relatable, because taking out the place name doesn't just leave a neat little gap, it leaves a syntactic car crash.
It really does.
We need to look at how removing a word breaks the grammar in the same way it would break an English sentence.
So, the Greek text of verse 1, if you remove the place name in Ephesus, reads literally, "To the saints who are and faithful in Christ Jesus."
Who are and faithful. That sounds terrible.
It does. The phrase "who are" translates the Greek participle ousin. Now, we have a massive control group for how Paul writes. In all of his other letters, he always follows this specific participial construction with a geographic location.
What are some examples of that?
In Romans 1.7, he writes, "To all who are in Rome." In Philippians 1.1, he writes, "To all the saints who are at Philippi." In 2 Corinthians 1.1, it is, "To all the saints who are throughout Achaia."
The pattern is crystal clear. A place name is syntactically required to complete the thought.
It is.
If I say to you, "I'm sending a package to the people who are," you're going to look at me and say, "Who or what? Who or where?" Stopping at "who are" makes no sense.
It leaves you hanging.
But the Greek gets even clunkier because of the conjunction that comes immediately after the missing place name.
Yes, the Greek conjunction kai, which means "and," follows the missing place name.
So if there is no location, the sentence reads, "To the saints who are also faithful."
Which creates a redundant and highly awkward sentence in Greek. It makes no logical sense to distinguish between saints and faithful people in this context, as if they were two entirely different groups.
Right, the grammar demands a location to balance the sentence. The saints who are living in a specific location and faithful in Christ Jesus.
Scribes in the ancient world were notoriously fastidious about grammar. They would often smooth out rough sentences. They would not intentionally create a sentence that sounded like a syntactic car crash.
Because the grammar is practically screaming that a word is missing, some scholars tried a different route. If the blank space theory fails, they reasoned, maybe there were two cities mentioned originally.
Yes, this is the two-city theory.
How does that one work?
Recognizing the severe grammatical issues of a single blank space, scholars like A. Van Roon and later A.T. Lincoln proposed an alternative hypothesis.
Trying to fix the and problem.
Exactly. They suggested that the original text actually contained two place names, specifically Hierapolis and Laodicea.
So how would the verse read then?
Their argument was that having two names would justify the presence of the conjunction and connecting them. So it would read, "To the saints who are in Hierapolis and Laodicea and faithful."
Let me guess. There is absolutely zero manuscript evidence to support the idea that Hierapolis and Laodicea were ever written in that verse.
There is no manuscript, no fragment of papyrus, no early translation, and no commentary by any ancient writer that contains those names in the opening of Ephesians.
So they just made it up.
It is pure conjecture. It is an invention designed to solve a grammatical problem, but it creates a historical problem out of thin air.
Plus, if a later scribe decided to delete those two names to make the letter more general, why would they leave the conjunction and behind, resulting in the awkward phrasing we just discussed?
That is the logical flaw. Scribes fixed grammar. They didn't break it on purpose.
Okay, so if the grammar doesn't work, and there is no historical proof of a mail merge, what did the people closest to the original writing actually think?
That is where the historical record gets fascinating.
Yeah, when we look at the early church fathers, did they seem as confused as 19th century British scholars? Let's look at the first few centuries.
The early church leaders actually reflected the variation we see in the manuscripts. The church was not a monolith on this textual issue.
Let's look at the skeptic side first.
Okay. In the early 3rd century, a prominent theologian named Origen, who lived in Alexandria, wrote a commentary on Ephesians.
And what did his copy say?
He quotes the opening verse without the words "in Ephesus." He clearly possessed a version of the text that was missing the city name.
And because Origen is a theologian, and a very allegorical one at that, he tries to explain the awkward grammar theologically instead of historically.
Yes. Origen looks at the phrase, "to the saints who are," and connects it directly to the Old Testament.
Oh, how so?
He references Exodus 3.14, where Yahweh reveals his name to Moses as, "I am who I am," or "the one who is."
So Origen speculates that Paul is making a massive metaphysical statement.
Right. He argues Paul is calling the believers those who are, meaning those who have true, eternal spiritual existence in contrast to the passing, temporary nature of the pagan world around them.
I have to admit, that is a highly creative attempt at interpretation, but it feels incredibly strained.
It is definitely a stretch.
He's taking a missing geographic word, a blank spot on a page, and trying to turn it into a massive philosophical statement about the nature of being itself. It sounds like he is trying to make theological lemonade out of a textual lemon.
That is a great way to put it. It is a classic example of an ancient thinker trying to solve a practical textual problem with a theological workaround.
But Origen wasn't the only one aware of this shorter text, right?
No, in the mid-4th century, Basil the Great also noted this peculiar reading and essentially repeated Origen's theological explanation.
And there was Jerome as well.
Yes, the Latin father Jerome, who translated the Vulgate, also knew of the alternative manuscript tradition that omitted the place name.
And then there's a really interesting note from Tertullian about a guy named Marcion. We should define who Marcion was because he is a major player in early church textual history.
He absolutely is.
Marcion was a wealthy shipbuilder in the 2nd century who essentially decided he hated the God of the Old Testament.
He had a very distorted theology.
Yeah, he believed the material world was evil, and he thought the God of the Jews was a harsh, angry deity, completely different from the loving Father revealed by Jesus. So Marcion took literal scissors to the Bible.
He just cut out what he didn't like.
Exactly. He cut out the entire Old Testament and he chopped up the New Testament, removing anything he felt was too Jewish. And Tertullian points out that Marcion called this specific document the letter to the Laodiceans.
Marcion's tendency to alter texts to fit his theology makes him an unreliable witness for the original wording, but his label is highly significant.
Why is that?
Because he probably possessed a copy of the letter that lacked the word Ephesus, just like Origen did. Seeing the missing destination, Marcion likely just guessed it was for Laodicea, perhaps based on a mention of a letter to Laodicea in the book of Colossians chapter 4.
So the key takeaway from Marcion, Origen, Basil, and Jerome is that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a variant manuscript tradition missing the place name was definitely circulating, primarily out of Egypt.
Yes, that much is historically certain.
But let's look at the other side of the aisle. If Origen is doing theological gymnastics in the 3rd century to explain the missing word, does anyone earlier give us a straight answer?
Yes, we have some heavy hitters on the traditional side.
Is there anyone who actually talked to the Ephesians or lived closer to the source? Because the traditionalists in the early church overwhelmingly supported the Ephesian destination.
The witness of the traditionalists is very robust. In the late 2nd century, we have Irenaeus, a major theologian who quotes from this letter 4 separate times in his writings.
And what does he call it?
He explicitly calls it the Epistle to the Ephesians.
Okay, that's clear. Who else?
In the mid-3rd century, Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, repeatedly quotes it and refers to it as Paul's epistle to the Ephesians.
And didn't Origen contradict himself on this?
He did. Even Origen, who gave us that strained theological explanation for the missing word in his commentary, cites the letter under the title of Ephesians in a completely different piece of his writings.
So he knew the traditional title, even if his specific manuscript lacked the word in verse 1.
Exactly. He knew what the rest of the church called it.
But the absolute earliest clue we have, the smoking gun, comes from a man named Ignatius. The context of his life is staggering. Tell us the setting for Ignatius and why his witness carries so much weight.
Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. Around the late 1st or early 2nd century, specifically during the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan, between AD 98 and 117, Ignatius was arrested.
This was during a period of heavy persecution.
Yes. He was being dragged across the empire by Roman soldiers to be executed in the Colosseum in Rome. As he traveled, he wrote letters to various churches along the route.
And he wrote one to Ephesus.
He did. He actually wrote a letter of his own to the church in Ephesus. In the introduction to his letter, he heavily alludes to Paul's letter to the Ephesians.
He incorporates Paul's words into his own letter.
Right. He uses many of the same distinct vocabulary words and theological expressions that Paul used.
He is literally on his way to be fed to wild beasts, and he is writing to the Ephesians. And he wouldn't use Paul's specific phrasing unless he was completely certain his readers in Ephesus would recognize the references immediately.
That is the crucial point. Ignatius assumes the Ephesian church knows Paul's letter intimately. He views them as the custodians of that specific apostolic instruction.
Which places this super early.
It makes Ignatius the earliest historical witness, placing the letter's destination firmly in Ephesus mere decades after it was originally composed by Paul.
So, if the earliest fathers, like Ignatius, the vast majority of all 5,000 manuscripts, and the basic rules of Greek grammar all point squarely to Ephesus, how do we explain the missing words in those 3 famous Alexandrian manuscripts?
We need a solution that fits all the facts.
We need a solution that accounts for all the evidence without inventing blank spaces or phantom cities. Let's look at the mechanics of early church services to find out why a scribe would alter the text.
To resolve this mystery, we turn to the local adaptation theory.
Tell me about that.
Scholars like Clinton E. Arnold, Rainer Schwint, and Harold Hohner have built a compelling case that the words in Ephesus are absolutely authentic. They were present in the original autograph penned by Paul.
Because the grammar demands it, and the history supports it.
Yes.
But that forces us to ask the logical question. If the name was there originally, why on earth would a scribe cross it out? What is the motive for deleting a historical geographical location from an apostolic letter?
The answer lies in how these texts were practically used in the early church. We call this the liturgical motive.
Okay, set the scene for us.
We have to visualize an early church gathering. Imagine a pastor in the 2nd century, located in Alexandria, Egypt. His congregation is facing persecution, poverty, and cultural pressure.
They need encouragement.
Right. They gather on a Sunday, and the pastor unrolls a copy of Paul's letter. If he reads, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus to the saints who are in Ephesus, it creates a psychological distance.
The congregation in Egypt might think, Well, that is a beautiful letter for the people over in Asia Minor, but what does it have to do with us?
Exactly. It feels like reading someone else's mail.
So the scribe intentionally drops the word Ephesus to make the text universally applicable.
That is the theory. If the pastor reads, "To the saints who are faithful in Christ Jesus," suddenly the letter is a direct, living word to the Egyptian believers sitting in that specific room. It removes the geographical barrier.
That is a fascinating mechanism. An early scribe in Egypt likely copied the letter and intentionally removed the place name to adapt the text for local public reading or liturgy.
They wanted the full weight of Paul's theological instruction to land directly on their own people. The intent was not malicious, it was pastoral adaptation.
Though it caused a massive headache for textual scholars centuries later.
Yes, it certainly did.
And we actually have a brilliant precedent for this behavior. It happened to another one of Paul's letters, demonstrating that this was a known practice.
We do see the exact same phenomenon occur in the transmission of the Book of Romans.
How so?
Several manuscript witnesses actually omit the words "in Rome" from Romans chapter 1, verse 7.
That is a huge parallel.
The renowned textual scholar Bruce Metzger noted that this was a deliberate excision made to show that the letter was of general, not local application.
So the motive to universalize a text by removing specific geographic markers was a documented practice among some scribes in the ancient world.
It was a known strategy.
The scribe in Egypt does this to Ephesians, and then that altered, adapted copy becomes the ancestor for Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and P46, which brings us back to a necessary reevaluation of the big three.
We really do need to look at them objectively.
Text critics in the 19th century treated them like gold, but they are not flawless.
While Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and P46 are incredibly valuable for establishing the early text of the New Testament, they are human artifacts and they contain errors. Modern textual editors do not follow them blindly.
Give us an example of where scholars reject them.
For instance, in the Nestle-Ellen Critical Edition of the Greek New Testament, which is the standard text used by scholars today, the editors actually reject the readings of these three manuscripts in several other parts of Ephesians.
So they aren't perfect even in this one letter.
Not at all. In verse 1.15, all three manuscripts omit the word love. In verse 4.24, they adopt an imperatival form of a verb rather than the correct infinitive. And in verse 4.29, they omit a definite article.
So scholars readily admit these Alexandrian manuscripts have flaws and idiosyncrasies.
They absolutely do.
And here is the piece of evidence that seals the case for me. Even though those three manuscripts omit the words "in Ephesus" in the actual flowing text of verse 1, they still contain a massive clue right on the page.
Yes, the titles.
They have the title "To the Ephesians" written as a superscript, a heading at the top of the document. Sinaiticus even has it written as a subscript at the very bottom of the scroll.
That superscript is highly revealing. It proves that even the scribes copying the variant text, the text lacking the place name in verse 1, still universally recognize the letter as belonging to the Ephesian tradition.
The title of the document never varied across the entire Roman Empire. It was always known as the letter to the Ephesians.
The historical pedigree is totally solid.
So the text seems completely secure. The words "in Ephesus" belong there. But critics still have one final objection they love to throw out.
The tone of the letter.
Yes. They say, if Paul spent 3 years living and ministering in Ephesus, and he knew these people intimately, why does this letter sound so incredibly impersonal? He doesn't greet a single person by name at the end of the letter.
It is a fair question on the surface.
I mean, if you read Romans, Paul lists dozens of people.
Mm.
In Ephesians, nothing. Why?
To answer the objection about the impersonal tone, we have to look at the massive demographic reality of ancient Ephesus. The socio-political climate of this city was intense.
It wasn't a small town.
Ephesus was not a small, quiet village. It was a bustling, massive metropolis, the capital of the Roman province of Asia, with a population hovering around 250,000 people.
That is massive for the ancient world.
It housed the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which drove a massive pagan economy.
And Paul ministered there extensively. He arrived after an 18-month stay in Corinth. His co-workers, Priscilla and Aquila, had actually started the preliminary outreach.
They laid the groundwork.
Paul then devoted himself to reaching the city from roughly AD 52 to the fall of AD 55. 3 whole years. You would think he would have a massive list of friends to say hello to.
You would think so if he were writing to a single congregation. But because of the size of the city and the length of Paul's ministry, the Christian community there grew exponentially.
There was a lot of friction, too.
Oh, absolutely. They faced riots from the silversmiths who made shrines to Artemis. The gospel disrupted the local economy. In this environment, there was no single mega building where everyone met on Sunday.
The community would have been organized into dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of distinct house churches scattered throughout the massive city and its sprawling suburbs.
So when Paul sits down to write this letter, he isn't just writing to a small group of 20 people he knows intimately from one living room. He is addressing a vast, highly diverse network of believers.
If he started listing personal greetings, the list would be impossibly long. It would take up half the valuable parchment, and he would inevitably leave someone out, causing offense among the various house churches.
Addressing a letter to the entire Ephesian Christian community necessitated a broader, more elevated tone. He was speaking to a massive network.
The theological instruction needed to apply to Jewish converts, Gentile converts, slaves, masters, the wealthy and the poor across the entire urban landscape.
Exactly. It had to speak to everyone.
But critics point to verse 1.15. Paul writes, "Ever since I heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus," they say, look, he says he heard of the faith. He doesn't even know them. You don't say you heard about the faith of people you lived with for 3 years.
That is a very common misreading of the historical timeline. We have to remember where Paul is when he writes this.
Where is he?
He is likely sitting in a Roman prison. By the time he pens Ephesians, he had been gone from the city for several years.
And a lot changes in a few years.
During his absence, the house churches continued to multiply. Hundreds of new converts had joined the community people Paul had never met personally.
So he is simply saying he received wonderful updates. His courier, Tychicus, or other travelers passing through Rome brought him news in prison.
They would say, Paul, the churches in Ephesus are thriving. The new believers, the ones who joined after you left, are growing.
And Paul writes back saying, "I heard the great news about your continued faith."
It is an expression of deep pastoral joy over their ongoing growth, not evidence of a lack of acquaintance.
That makes total sense. So when we synthesize all of this evidence, the manuscripts, the grammar, the early church fathers, the liturgical habits of Egypt, and the demographics of the city, we arrive at a balanced, historically grounded view.
A view that honors all the data.
The letter was absolutely originally designated for Ephesus, but it was also designed with a broader scope in mind from the very beginning.
It was a theological masterwork intended for regional distribution. It would first circulate among the dozens of Ephesian house churches.
Yes, and because Ephesus was a major commercial hub with roads leading everywhere, the letter would naturally travel outward.
The book of Acts tells us that during Paul's 3 years in Ephesus, all the residents of the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. The Ephesian leadership likely had immense influence over nearby towns.
So the courier takes the letter, reads it in the various house churches in Ephesus, and then believers make copies. They walk a day or two to nearby towns.
Places like Lebados, Colophon, Magnesia, Trells, Miletus.
And eventually, copies might make it all the way out to Lycus Valley, reaching places like Colossae and Laodicea.
We know from the letters of Ignatius that there were established thriving churches in Magnesia and Trellis shortly after this period. The letter radiated outward from Ephesus.
This resolves the mystery beautifully. It is a specific letter addressed to a real place with a real history, but its contents were elevated and broad enough to instruct the entire region of Asia Minor.
The physical transmission of historical texts is a wonderfully messy human process.
It involves scribes making pastoral judgment calls in Egypt, massive academic debates in 19th century Britain, and grammatical puzzles that take decades to unravel.
Yet through careful linguistic and historical analysis, a completely coherent picture emerges.
We see a localized text firmly rooted in the massive, noisy city of Ephesus, spreading out to influence the wider world.
It is a phenomenal example of how rigorous historical study clarifies the text, anchoring it firmly in the objective realities of the first-century Mediterranean world.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We saw how early scribes might have intentionally removed the words "in Ephesus" to make the letter feel more immediately relevant to their own local congregations.
They adapted it for their moment.
They stripped away the historical address to make it fit their present moment. And that raises a fascinating question for us today. When we read ancient texts, do we have a tendency to strip them of their original gritty historical context to make them fit our modern lives more easily?
That is a challenging question.
Or do we take the necessary time to understand the original audience first, trusting that the specific, messy history actually enhances the meaning for us today? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep reading and keep questioning.